By the time the sirens painted my street red, I'd already scrubbed my fingerprints off the glass, deleted the photos, and buried the ring in a planter that didn't belong to me. And if that sounds like a confession, it isn't, it's a reckoning. Because this isn't a story about good people who made one mistake. It's about the moment a heart cracks loud enough for a whole neighborhood to hear. People always say the house knows before the heart does. The chipped paint curling away from the baseboards, the cabinet door that won't stay shut, the light bulb that burns out too fast, as if the bones of a place whisper warnings while the couple inside pretends to sleep, and maybe that's why I saw it right away when the screen lit up on the counter. Miss you already tonight? From Nora at 11:42 a.m. as a pot of water juddered on the stove and steam rose like a secret too hot to hold. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't even looking, not really, just wiping a ring of coffee off the marble while the kettle hissed. And when the name appeared, the words turned the kitchen fluorescent too bright to bear. And the next breath tasted like pennies and old grief. The way blood feels when you bite your lip to keep from asking a question you already dread the answer to. My husband, Ethan, a man who could fix leaks with his fingertips but never noticed when I stopped wearing my favorite earrings, was upstairs trimming his beard, humming something low and thoughtless. The same tune he used on the weekends when he washed the car, and came in smelling like sunlight and soap. And the part of me that still wanted him to be the man I married reached for the phone and set it down with shaking hands. Like maybe I could undo the act by returning the device to its exact angle on the counter. I scrolled, because of course I did. I scrolled through months threaded like someone else's beadwork, through inside jokes about Green Scarf Girl, which must have been me once, through Monday meetings that weren't meetings, and missed you last night, after nights when he'd lain beside me turned toward the wall, and every ping felt like the snap of a thin wire under tension, each one a note in a song I hadn't realized we'd been dancing to alone. Shock, then anger, then that cold, efficient calm that comes when the body decides to survive even if the spirit hasn't voted yet. And in that glacial breath I thought, no broken plates, no theatrics, not yet. First, evidence, then a plan, because people underestimate the quiet ones until they're rearranging the room with their hands and never raising their voices. Nora was married. Her last name matched a pair of packages on our porch last fall, neighbors who lost a delivery, a laugh on the sidewalk, thanks, see you around, and her husband's name was listed on the HOA roster. Julian Hale, a long-distance runner with a stern jaw, a softness around the eyes that made him look like he apologized for the weather. The kind of man who waved from across the street with an open palm that made strangers feel safer than they should. I didn't decide right then what I would do. I decided what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't give Ethan the headline he expected, the melodrama he could file under emotional wife, the single moment he could circle like a coffee stain to justify all the text messages that came before. Because if betrayal is a language, I was going to learn to speak it without losing the part of me that still knew the taste of sunlight and soap. The city felt colder that afternoon, less like a place and more like a test of endurance, and the buses sighed like old men, and a woman in a yellow coat laughed so hard her scarf trailed in the wind. And I had the strangest thought that maybe the world goes on because it doesn't know what else to do. And in the grocery store, I picked up pears and put them back because the skin bruised under my thumb. Too tender for a house that had just learned its voice. That night, Ethan kissed my hair and told me he'd be late on Thursday again. Project deadlines. You know how it is. And I nodded. I always know how it is, I said. But the truth was something new was moving in the walls, and every sound we made echoed back wrong, like the house had shifted a fraction of an inch to the left, and we hadn't noticed until the hallway ran at a slant. I slept with the phone on the nightstand facing me. He slept on his side of the bed facing the wall, and between us an arm's length of air became a field of winter grass, brittle and whispering. And when I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed I was standing in the middle of our street while the homes around me breathed in and out, shutters blinking, roofs rising and falling like chests, and they were all saying the same thing. Choose the version of yourself you can live with. Julian ran at dusk when the sidewalks were half shadow, and the last of the day turned the maple leaves to stained glass, and I chose that time to be outside, pruning a rosemary that didn't need pruning, clipping sprigs that perfumed my wrists with a green, resinous calm I didn't feel. Because if I was going to unspool a life, I wanted my hands to smell like something alive. He saw me and slowed without curiosity, the way solid men slow because they've built a habit of noticing, and he touched his chest as if to say pardon the sweat without saying a word. And I said, Julian, right? And he smiled the shy yes of a person who would never start a fire but might walk through one if asked. And I knew two things with absurd clarity. Nora didn't deserve him, and neither did I. We haven't talked since the package thing, I said, because beginning with small, harmless truths kept the larger ones from setting the shrubs alight. And he laughed and said, Right, the shoes that weren't mine until they were. And laughter opened something between us that wasn't quite a door, more like a window lifted a few inches to let in night air tinged with damp earth and bread from the bakery on Pine. We spoke about nothing, which is how you speak before you step into a room where everything burns. About sports schedules and a new coffee place that over-roasted the beans. About the stray calico that slept on 3 porches like a diplomat. And I tried to hear the shape of his life in its innocuous syllables, the way a musician knows a song by the key it hums in. And I kept my voice, even until his eyes held mine a fraction of a second too long. I didn't say, Do you know your wife is tearing holes in my ceiling? And he didn't say, Do you know your husband is trying on my wife's laugh? Because that wasn't the time, and a runner knows timing the way sailors know wind, and when he said, I usually do another mile, I said, Then I won't keep you. And he thanked me like I'd done him a kindness by not telling the truth. After he left, the rosemary clung to my hands, a green saint blessing bad decisions in advance, and I went inside to the mirror and studied the face I'd been carrying for years, all those expressions practiced for dinner parties and dentist chairs. No, it didn't hurt, and yes, the table is lovely. And I thought of my mother saying, You can be honest or you can be polite. If you're careful, you can be both, but if you must choose, choose the honesty that doesn't make you small. Thursday came, as Thursdays always do, with a long bright stretch that smells like copy paper and car interiors, and Ethan wore a shirt I'd ironed and a cologne I hadn't bought, and at 6:12 p.m. he texted, Don't wait up, and at 6:14 p.m. I texted back an empty heart, because sometimes the silence needs a symbol to lean on, and at 6:16 p.m. I put on a sweater the color of storm light and walked to Pine Street, because I wanted a coffee so badly it felt like a dare. Nora was there, of course she was, because novels are improbable and life is predictable. Shoulder-length hair tucked behind one ear like a sail tied down, gold studs, a devotion to tidy lines, the kind of beauty built on restraint, and she didn't see me until she did. And when she did, her smile was a bright blade, and she stepped forward with a hand on the back of a chair as if the furniture needed steadying. Lee, she said my name, tasting strange in her mouth, and I said, Nora, as if the syllables were truce and not a starting pistol, and she gestured to the chair across from her. And the room hushed around us like a theater waiting for the orchestra to lift its bows, and we sat down. I think we can make this civilized, she said, and the way she said civilized made me wish for rude, for raised voices and slammed cups, because a cleaned-up disaster is still a disaster. Only now it smiles in photos, and I said, You think so? And she nodded like she'd practiced the nod in a mirror. We're adults, she said, as though adulthood were a talisman we could hold against the heat. And we have things to lose. And she looked me full in the face so I'd hear the threat inside the offering. The way a lullaby can hold a warning if you sing it in a different key. And I propose we keep the essentials, she said, and I said, Define essentials, and she smiled, small and pleased. Marriages remain intact, she said, ticking items off like errands. No scenes, no revelations, no scorched earth. And then, as if placing a final neat cherry atop the indecency. And the extraneous attachments continue, discreetly, and something in me, some ligament that had held a long time under careful load, made a sound like a door unhinging. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I said, What do you call it when a person uses another person's decency as a shield? And Nora said, Practical, and I said, I call it laundering harm. And the barista set down 2 waters and looked at us like people look at dogs poised to bolt. And Nora said, You're sentimental, and I said, You're efficient, and she smiled like I'd paid her a compliment. Julian doesn't need to know, she said, using her husband's name like a tool, and I said, Maybe he needs to choose, and she said, Choice is a word we give to pain to domesticate it. And I said, Maybe pain doesn't want a leash. And we stared at each other across a green plant I couldn't name while the espresso machine sighed like an exhausted god. Think about it, she said, rise and glide, perfume like citrus and steel. And when she left, the chair across from me felt warm as if the seat itself had absorbed her certainty, and I thought of Julian's dusk runs and the way his breath fogged in cold weather, the honest labor of it. And I knew if this was a game I was the wrong kind of player. Too slow to cheat, too quick to bleed. It's strange, the velocity of a lie once it's agreed upon. How easily it makes corners where there used to be straight lines. How the tongue learns to say meeting instead of motel. How a ring can gleam like a lighthouse and still fail to warn the ship. And a week after the coffee shop, I sat with a calendar and two highlighters and mapped a life that left just enough empty squares to look innocent. Nora called it an arrangement. I called it a fire break. Cut the brush in controlled lines, and maybe the flames wouldn't take the whole forest, except if you've ever stood too close to fire, you know it leaps. The whole point of flame is the leap, and I knew even as I agreed that what I was saving wasn't a marriage, but my image of myself as a person who could keep a promise under duress. Julian ran past again at dusk, and this time he stopped at my gate with no pretext, sweat turning the collar of his shirt a darker blue, and he said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Define okay." And he laughed without mirth like a man who has trained the body to outpace the mind, and just now realizes the mind has been hitchhiking behind the whole time. And I said, "Walk with me." Because sometimes the only way to say a hard thing is while both people are looking at the same tree. We walked along the quiet blocks where porches wear their pumpkins too long and curtains glow like secrets, and I told him a softened version of the truth to test the seam. "Ethan and I are struggling." And he said, "Nora and I are too." And the night accepted our mutual omissions like pastoral absolution. And we stood at the corner under a lamp that hummed and swarmed with tiny lives we never notice until they thrummed the light with their insistence. "If there's something you need to tell me," he said, which is not a question but a key, and I held my breath and knit my fingers together behind my back so the truth would have somewhere to go, and I said, "I think I'm about to do something I'll regret," and he said, "Then don't." And I said, "It's complicated," and he said, "So are knots," as if untying were a practice you could train for. I didn't kiss him then. The kiss would come later when the earth had shifted just enough to make balance a choice and not a default. But I did look at his face and see, not safety, not a savior, but a human startled to find himself at the edge of a field where controlled burns had failed. And sometimes the decent thing is to say plainly, "There is fire." And sometimes the decent thing is to pass the water before naming the blaze. The first time with Julian didn't happen in a kitchen with wine. It happened in the old limestone conservatory at the park, where evening collects like an old song and the air smells like damp fern and brass. And we had met for the kind of talk grown people pretend not to need. "What do you want? Do you want me? Who are we if we say yes?" And the kiss came like relief, like winter light through glass, honest in the way survival sometimes is, not noble but true. If you are waiting for me to confess shame, know this. Shame came later, with the laundry and the folding of t-shirts that still held Ethan's shape, with the calendar squares I colored and pretended were not prisons, with the way my name sounded in Julian's mouth like a bell I had been afraid to ring, and the pact I'd made with Nora tightened like a band around my ribs, a clever corset laced by an enemy who knew my vanity. Nora kept her word at first, the way architects keep to blueprints until the ground reveals its secrets, and Ethan was careful with his scent and his shirts and his stories, and we were four people performing competence on a narrow stage. And if the audience applauded, it was only because we never missed our marks, and applause is not approval, it's a sound people make to remind themselves they are alive. One night, my phone lit with a photo. Nora, in a dress the color of pomegranate rind, standing in a hotel mirror with a hand on the sink as if steadying the world, the caption, "Running a little late." And I didn't answer because the rage that rose in me wasn't about the dress or the lateness. It was about the audacity to narrate the harm like it was a lifestyle choice, and I threw the phone onto the couch, and it bounced and landed face down like a petulant child. "You want the turn, here it is." 3 days later, a manila envelope with no return address pressed flat in our mailbox like a hand over a mouth. Inside, a clean printout of texts that were not mine. Photos angled just off faces, hotel receipts, a copy of our HOA newsletter with a red circle around our names like a target on a carnival booth, and a note in neat block letters. "We all owe someone the truth. The thing about war is that the first explosion is never the one that ruins you. It's the second, the third, the one you didn't brace for because you thought there was honor left in the rules. And in our little domestic theater, the first explosion was the envelope. The second was the realization that the handwriting was Nora's. The third was the late-night message to my old work email from an address I didn't recognize. Ask Julian about Portland. Portland was a conference last spring, a hotel with glass elevators, and a view of a river that moved like a patient muscle. And Julian had gone for 2 days, come back with maple candies and a sweatshirt too large for me that I wore anyway because women are trained to accept largeness as generosity. And now this, ask him about it, as if the past were a locked drawer and I'd been given a key late and with malice. I didn't accuse, I asked, because my mother's voice again, be honest if you can, and we sat in my car outside the grocery at 9 p.m. because what is more honest than fluorescent aisles and a windshield smeared by rain? And I said, Portland. And he said, what about it? And I said, is there anything you want to tell me? And he looked at his hands like men look at maps after the road has already decided to flood. There was someone, he said, the words a slow extraction, before all this, before we. And he didn't have to finish the sentence because the timeline wrote itself in the fog on the glass. A man who had not yet discovered his wife's infidelity, a business trip, a moment of loneliness turned to body, not an excuse but a fact, and there it was. No saints in this story, only people and their choices wearing human names. I didn't know whether to thank him for the truth or ask why he had kept it like a talisman he could rub when the room tilted, and I said, did Nora know? And he said, I don't think so, and I said, she does now, and handed him a copy of the envelope note I'd typed out, because if the game is played with paper, I can play with paper too. What do you do when the person you chose as your shelter turns out to be a house with a faulty foundation? You can shore up the beams, or you can move out before the roof collapses. And for a week we walked around like emergency workers after the sirens have gone. Quiet, purposeful, setting aside the breakables. But the sirens had not gone, they had simply changed pitch, and the building codes kept changing under our feet. Nora, it turned out, didn't want a stalemate. She wanted a stage, and she sent Ethan the same packet with a different note. Ask Lee about Saturday mornings. And he did, not with fury but with the puzzlement of a man who can't resolve the contradiction. My wife who packs my lunch and my wife who lies to my face. And I watched him search my face for the version of me that would rescue him from the truth. I need to know, he said, which is the saddest sentence a person can offer another. The request to be made whole by a narrative that will break them further. And I said, yes, because I decided months ago to choose the version of myself I could live with. And he sat back in the chair as if I had pushed him, and the oven timer beeped into the silence like a cruel joke. Here is a thing I learned from the envelope. Sometimes the person who sets the fire stands close enough to warm their hands but far enough not to blister, and Nora kept sending missives, an address on a post-it, a time, a grainy photo. Little weights tied to balloons to keep them from floating out of reach, and the woman had a gift for plausible deniability that would have impressed a statesman. I began to think about consequences the way a chess player thinks about knights. Not in straight lines but in L shapes, two forward one aside, because the story we were in was not going to let anyone exit clean, and the realization that there were no clean exits was the first honest thing I had felt in months, and it steadied me. The way a terrible forecast can make a person decide whether to board up or leave town. The ring in the planter wasn't mine. It was Nora's, thin band, tiny emerald like a trapped leaf. And I found it in the conservatory after a meeting that wasn't with Ethan's department head turned into a rendezvous that shouldn't between the two of them before our mess even had the courtesy to pick one room. And I palmed the band with a calm that felt like someone else's prayer. People talk about revenge like it's a dessert, but it's a solvent. It strips things, it thins paint, it makes the shape under the color show through. And I didn't want to dissolve anyone, only the lie that had made me small. So I set the ring where I knew Nora would look when she wanted proof of a different story. And I waited, and the waiting felt like pressing a bruise to remember that the body exists. The sirens came on a Tuesday, because tragedy loves an unremarkable day, and they splashed the street with their garish insistence, and people stepped onto porches to watch the theater of other people's urgency. And in the middle of it, a single fact. Julian collapsed at the end of his route, dehydration and a heart that misfired like an engine flooded by too much trying. I got the call because my number was the last text in his phone, and the nurse said, he's asking for Lay. And I said, I'm here. The way we say I'm here to babies and the dying. And I drove with my hands clenched around the wheel and the taste of rosemary rising like a ghost from my skin. And the hospital smelled like lemon and overcooked coffee and the particular dread of fluorescent light at midnight. In the white room, Julian looked both older and like himself, which is to say human, which is to say not a refuge but a person with organs that fail and eyes that water. And he held my hand with a pressure that said stay. And I did, and it was not noble, it was not scandalous. It was what you do when the person you have chosen is attached to a machine that beeps and tells you where the oxygen ends. Nora arrived like a weather change, carrying her certainty like a handbag, and she stood at the foot of the bed and said nothing, which was an upgrade, and I moved my hand away because we were not going to perform for an audience, not tonight, not in this antiseptic church, and a doctor said words, and a nurse nodded, and bureaucracy and mercy braided themselves the way they do in rooms where people almost die but don't. After in the parking lot under a sky flayed open to the bone, Nora said, "You set me up," and I said, "You set me on fire." And we looked like women in a painting people misread as sisters. And she said, "He will never forgive you," and I said, "Maybe forgiveness isn't the currency here." And her mouth tightened the way mouths do when they're holding back the scream they think will undo the day. Ethan texted at 2:17 am. "Where are you?" And I didn't answer because sometimes the kindest thing is not to hand someone the rope they'll use to tie their own hands. And by morning, the sirens were just a memory. The street washed and blank as a stage before the evening show, and I stood at the kitchen sink and watched sunlight turn the water into strands of glass, and decided I was done being careful. We did not stay. We did not burn it all down in grand gestures either. We did the unglamorous thing people mistake for cowardice and call survival. We told the truth, we moved out, we returned keys, we boxed up the life and labeled the cartons winter and miscellaneous, and do not open when tired. And we rented a place with bad carpet and a great window, and let the city be unromantic around us while we learned to cook small dinners meant for two. This is where a tidy narrative would say we healed, or we didn't, but neither is useful. What happened is we practiced, because healing is repetition. Breath in, breath out, walk to the corner, wave to the man with the dog, remember to buy milk. And sometimes the practice worked and sometimes it didn't. And on the days it didn't, we sat on the floor and named 5 things we could see because a therapist on a podcast said grounding helps. Ethan sent one letter on paper in his small, exact hand, and it said, "If I could go back," which is the beginning of a fairy tale only time can write, and I wrote back. So would I, because the truth is most of us would walk a different corridor if we knew which doors locked behind us so quickly. And I didn't mail it because some letters are meant to be written and kept, not delivered. Nora moved 3 blocks east into a condo with high ceilings and a balcony for plants. Sometimes I pass it and count the pots and wonder if the rosemary is thriving, whether it smells like absolution on her wrists. And then I remember absolution isn't a scent you can buy. It's a decision you make by making it again. And I stop at the bakery on Pine and order bread that cracks when you tear it and eat it warm without apology. If this sounds like a confession, it isn't. It's a map not to follow, but to know the shape of the wilderness others have survived, and the lesson, if there is one worth offering, is small and hard and ordinary. Secrets are not seeds, they do not stay buried and bloom into anything we can name. They are stones in the pocket, and the body will ledger their weight until the day something in you says enough. One night late, the house made that sound again, the baseboard pop of old wood settling. And I realized it wasn't an omen, it was a home being a home, and I laughed. And Julian looked up from a book and smiled, and we turned off the lamp and lay in the very human dark where bodies breathe and forgivable noises happen. And for a long time neither of us spoke, and the quiet was not a threat. It was a room that fit. It was a room that fit.